going for some thunder this morning, apparently. Wow. You know, we joke sometimes about having a zip line from the balcony. Check, check, check. 1, 2. All right. Oh, there we go. Hey. I don't know. I kind of like the... Wow. I don't know. Ian, I might just borrow this one. Do you want me to switch? I'm going to switch now. I don't know what's going on with... You know, we've tried so many things with this pack, and anyways... I wouldn't believe me if I told you, but we did test the mic just before the service. You know, it's appropriate that we have some thunder going on for today because we got a fun story that we're going to be looking at, and you will see what I mean in just a moment. But we are in a series, if you haven't been with us so far this new year, we're in a series called The Stories You Thought You Knew. And it's been a really fun series to dig a little deeper into the biblical text and kind of challenge some of our assumptions maybe that we've made in the hearing of these stories. Sometimes some of these famous stories of the Bible are stories that kind of get a mythological status. And sometimes when they do that, the actual true story that's written in the pages of Scripture is not what we think. Right? We get a little bit mixed up in some of the details and how the story actually plays out. And so we've been having a lot of fun digging back into some of these famous stories of the Bible to dig in and see, you know, what more can we actually draw from these and see what God has shown us about who He is and who we are. And sometimes those stories are really great for holding up a little bit of a mirror to us for us to do some self-reflection and consideration of what God may be wanting to say to us and challenge in us. And today's story, I think, is no different than that. Because today, we get to dive into the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal. If you say Baal, that's okay. I might go back and forth between Baal and Baal. Anyways, who knows? I think it's actually pronounced Baal, but it doesn't matter that much. So, Elijah and the prophets of Baal, which was a supernatural showdown that happened many, many years ago on a mountainside, when God decided to show up and show everybody who He truly was. So, let's set the stage as we dive into this really fun story today. And set the stage, first of all, by talking about the players that are involved in this story. First of all, as you may have guessed from the title slide, Elijah is one of the key players in this story. Elijah, who was a prophet of God that shows up in the book of 1 Kings. We mentioned a couple weeks ago that all throughout the history of the kings of the Bible, God sent prophets along the way to speak to the kings, to try and draw them back in alignment with God's character and His commands. And time again, we see the pattern that the kings reject the word of the Lord and continue on in their own way into wickedness, and it causes all sorts of trouble for God's people, eventually leading them even into exile from their own land. But Elijah is one of these prophets. And he's one that kind of just shows up all of a sudden in 1 Kings 17. Not much of an introduction at all. And all of a sudden he's thrust onto this incredibly large stage with the king of the northern kingdom of Israel. It might just be interesting for you to know that Elijah's name actually means the Lord is God. Hold on to that one as we go through the story today. Second character you should be aware of today is the king of the northern kingdom of Israel. That was the kingdom that had 10 of the tribes of Israel in it after they split. And that's King Ahab. Ahab went and married a woman by the name of Jezebel. Jezebel, you know, when that name kind of rings out in our culture as someone who's kind of conniving and evil and wicked. Anyways, this is Jezebel. This is sort of the prototype for that. And this is what it says about Ahab and Jezebel. In 1 Kings 16, Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. That is quite a resume. He not only considered it trivial to commit the sins of Jeroboam, son of Nebat, but he also married Jezebel, daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and began to serve Baal and worship him. A law-breaking king. There was instructions about who the king was supposed to marry. Didn't follow that. And not only that, but he also started to worship this other god, not Yahweh, the God of the Israelites, but Baal. And brought his prophets in to be doing a whole bunch of the work and the priestly duties around that. following this other god, this other idol. Incidentally, if you don't know, Baal is the god of fertility, or the god of rain and dew, as well as the god of storms, which is an important note as we think about the backdrop of this story. Because the backdrop of this story is that God sends a drought on the land. 1 Kings 17:1. As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, this is Elijah, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. God sends a drought, which is pretty awesome, when Baal, the one Ahab is worshiping, is supposed to be the god of dew and rain. And yet there's no dew or rain coming. So the drought comes at God's command, which sets up, a few years later, a showdown that's going to happen on Mount Carmel. If you're not familiar where Mount Carmel is, you can probably see on the map up here. It's right by this little point on Israel, where it kind of juts out a little bit there. The Carmel range kind of goes up towards it and kind of peaks just a little bit before that. The city of Haifa in modern-day Israel is right there. So when you look at pictures from the top of Mount Carmel looking out towards the sea, you can actually see Haifa in the background as you're looking out towards the sea, which is kind of cool. So that's where the showdown is going to take place, kind of up in the northern part of Israel and right on the coast. Now, as we come into this story, there's two big questions in play in this story. And the first question is, who is responsible for this disaster? This disaster of the drought. Now, we know God sent the drought, but why has the drought come? Who is the problem that's causing this thing from the gods, you could probably say, for some people's perspective back then? Who is responsible and the problem for why this drought has come? The second question is, who is truly God? Is it going to be Yahweh or Baal? Who is the one who is actually God? So, as we dive into this story, I think one of the things we can see right away is that God is actually setting to pick a fight. Now, I know that's probably not, maybe the way we think about God a lot of the time. And I want to be careful with the language and how I use this. But God is the one who's actually setting up the moment that's going to cause this showdown, this conflict between the prophets of Baal and the prophet of Yahweh. He's the one who actually caused the conditions to happen. He is the one who wants to confront his people with the fact that they've been worshiping a false god and call them back to himself. See, God is incredibly zealous or jealous for his name. And he's incredibly zealous for his people. And he wants his people to know him alone and not chase after other gods. And so I think we can see, actually, through this story, we'll see how God actually picks a fight in order to accomplish that purpose, to start drawing his people back to himself and to confront a wicked king and an idolatrous people. So, let's see how this plays out. 1 Kings chapter 18, starting in verse 1. After a long time, in the third year, the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land. So Elijah went to present himself to Ahab. So God sends Elijah from where Elijah's been hiding out. We'll get to that in a minute. To go present himself to Ahab, which is a little funny, right? There's this incredible thing that happens throughout this story that demonstrates the impotence of King Ahab versus the power of Elijah as God's prophet. And we see this play out again and again throughout this story. And it starts here, because Ahab is out wandering the land. He can't find Elijah anywhere, even though he's looking for him. Not only can't he find Elijah, he can't even find good grass for his herds to graze on. He's going searching all over Israel to try and find a place to graze his herds and flocks. So we have this picture of a king in the seat of power and authority who is unable to find good things that his people need, or this one who he considers to be a troubler of Israel, Elijah. Now, on the other side of it, we have Elijah. And Elijah, since the drought started, God sent him over east of the Jordan, and he spent some time over there beside a little brook, and God sent ravens to bring food to Elijah, miraculously. The birds would just come. Here we see crows coming and taking away food. there the ravens were coming and bringing food to Elijah, like, pre-modern DoorDash, right? Like, it was pretty cool. So Elijah's getting fed beside this brook because God is miraculously sending him food. Then the brook dries up, and God says, okay, Elijah, enough with this. Now I want you to go to Zarephath, which is just a little ways up north from Mount Carmel near the coast. And you're going to go to a widow's house. She doesn't have any food either, but I'm going to provide for you and her. So Elijah goes, and sure enough, God again miraculously provides for this widow and her family and Elijah, and they have food to eat during the drought. So Ahab can't find stuff that he needs during the drought. Elijah's provided for by God during the drought. Ahab can't find Elijah. God sends Elijah to Ahab because he can't figure it out. Right? Power of God's prophet versus the impotence of the king. So let's go down to verse 17 to see how their encounter played out. When Ahab saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" "I've not made trouble for Israel," Elijah replied, "but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals." Yeah, Baal was sort of both considered to be one kind of god and also sort of regional gods. There was sort of twofold of this. So that's why the Baals, because there was sort of the regional sense of that. Which brings us back, though, to the first question, right? The first question we were asked about this text: who is the problem? Who is the one who is truly the troubler of Israel? Ahab clearly thinks it's Elijah. Elijah clearly sees that it's Ahab. Why does it matter? Well, there's a bit of a throwback in this moment, a connection to a story we actually talked about a month and a half ago, when we looked at the story of Joshua and the Israelites taking over the city of Jericho. And in that story, what happened was they were told that they were not to take anything from that city when they defeated it. They were to burn everything. They were supposed to keep none of the plunder whatsoever. It was supposed to be a sacrifice to the Lord as they started into the promised land. But what happened was there was one Israelite by the name of Achan. And Achan decided that he was going to keep some of the things for himself, a really nice looking robe, some gold, some silver, and he was going to pocket that and keep those things even though the Lord had told them not to keep anything. And as a result, when the Israelites went to attack the next city, the little town of Ai, they were soundly defeated. Because God wasn't going with them into that fight, while they were not living in obedience to him. So they found out it was Achan who was the problem. He was the troubler of Israel, who had caused this trouble for them that they lost the fight. And he was executed, and then when they went in, they were able to take the land. And they were able to defeat Ai and the cities to follow. And so as Ahab is thinking about their history, he's thinking, we have a troubler of Israel again, and it's Elijah. And if we can just eliminate Elijah, the rain will come. Right? This is what's on his mind. Elijah, however, sees that Ahab is actually the one who's a problem. He's the one who has brought Baal worship into Israel. He is the one who's causing all the people to fall into idolatry. So as the story unfolds, we're going to continue to see how it's proven who is truly the troubler of Israel and what it's going to take for God to send the rain. So, let's carry on. Verse 19, "Now summon the people from all over Israel," this is Elijah talking to Ahab, "to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." So Ahab sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal is God, follow him." But the people said nothing. Then Elijah said to them, "I'm the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I'll prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I'll call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God." Then all the people said, "What you say is good." No kidding. This is getting juicy, right? This is going to be awesome. Get to see fire falling down and consuming an offering. Like, this is going to be incredible. Who wouldn't want to see that? All right, so the challenge is there. The gauntlet's thrown down. Let's do this thing. And let's see who is truly God. There's a couple little notes I just want to make about this challenge. It's pretty self-explanatory, but there's a few things that I think are interesting. First one is that notice who shows up at the mountain. The people of Israel show up. Elijah shows up. Ahab shows up. And the 450 prophets of Baal show up. Who doesn't? Jezebel and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at her table don't show up. Which again points to the impotence of Ahab the king, who can't even make the prophets that serve his wife show up on the mountain for this contest. He can't even run his own household as king. Contrast that again with Elijah's power in the Lord. So, hold on to that one. Second thing is that the people, Elijah says, are wavering between two opinions. But as much as they're wavering between two opinions, they're not really quite as neutral as that sounds. Well, the people, sure, maybe be kind of waffling back and forth. They've clearly been worshiping Baal. In fact, we know that in part because of the broken down status of the altar to the Lord, which Elijah has to rebuild in verse 30. It's broken down on the side of Mount Carmel. It's not being used because they've been worshiping Baal. But God is about to call them back in a dramatic way. And then this statement about the one who answers by fire is truly God. Ultimately, that's going to answer both the second question of who is God, as well as the first question, because then we'll know, which God actually answered by fire will tell us who the troubler of Israel was, right? So Baal, the god of fertility, of rain and dew and storms, could he send lightning and light this thing up? Or will it be the Lord, Yahweh, the God of Israel, who has been known to lead his people by fire and smoke, and actually also consume offerings? Like when the angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah and his wife before the birth of Samson. And they left an offering, and he consumed that offering with fire. So we know, either way, it's looking like this is going to happen one way or the other. We're going to see truly who is God. Which brings us to the showdown. Elijah invites the prophets of Baal to go first. After all, there's 450 of them. They should be able to build an altar, slaughter a bull, and get it set up pretty quick, right? Shouldn't take them very long. They got the numbers on their side. So this is what it says in chapter 18, verse 25 and 26. Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose one of the bulls and prepare it first, since there's so many of you. Call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire." So they took the bull given them and prepared it. Then they called on the name of Baal from morning till noon. "Baal, answer us," they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar they had made. The prophets of Baal get their religious rites on. They start dancing. They start doing their thing. They got the altar all set up. They are trying to compel Baal to answer through doing all these different practices and things. Maybe if we dance a little bit higher, maybe if we dance a little bit longer, maybe if we're a little bit louder, then he's going to show up. Maybe we can twist his arm if we do things just the right way. Verse 27. Elijah encourages them. Not so much. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. "Shout louder," he said. "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he's deep in thought. Maybe, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened." Oh, yeah. I mean, it's super funny. It's not that clever, but it's super funny, right? So the prophets of Baal, this is the crazy part. The prophets of Baal actually do some of what Elijah's suggesting. They start shouting louder, right? They start shouting louder. They start cutting themselves with their knives and swords. Like they're trying to, do anything they can to compel their God to answer with fire. But verse 29 tells us there was still no answer. No one paid any attention. Silence. In the midst of all the chaos and the dancing and the shouting and the cutting and the bleeding, there was silence in response. So the time of evening sacrifice comes. And Elijah calls everyone from gathering around the altar to Baal over to him. He says, "Come over to me, it's my turn now." Verse 30. Elijah said to all the people, "Come here to me." Then they came to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Remember, we said that the altar of the Lord was in disrepair because it hadn't been used by the people because they were worshiping Baal. So Elijah repairs the altar. Now, one of the interesting pieces of this is the altar shouldn't have been there in the first place. The Israelites knew where they were supposed to worship their God, and it wasn't at an altar on Mount Carmel. It was at the temple in Jerusalem. That was where they were to be worshiping their God. But when the kingdom split, the king of the northern kingdom was afraid that his people, if they went to Jerusalem for all the festivals to worship their God, they would lose loyalty to him and would go back to Judah. And so he actually set up a couple of other idols in a couple cities in the northern kingdom. And then we also see these altars built on high places where people would feel closer to God, where they would offer their sacrifices. So this altar shouldn't have actually been there. And after this whole thing is done, it won't be there. God's going to take care of that. So Elijah rebuilds the altar of the Lord. And then verse 31, he took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Your name shall be Israel." How many stones? 12 stones. Not 10 stones. Not just the northern kingdom of Israel that Ahab was king over. 12 stones. One unified people of God. The stones representing every one of the 12 tribes, the 12 sons of Jacob, who was called Israel. And he builds them together onto this altar. Then verse 33. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. Then he said to them, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood." "Do it again," he said. And they did it again. "Do it a third time," he ordered. And they did it at the third time. The water ran down around the altar and even filled the trench. He had dug a trench around it. I'm thinking probably to catch a lot of the blood from the bull after it had been killed. But it also served to fill it up with water as they soaked the offering. Interestingly, a couple things you might be wondering about at this point. Number one, where are they getting water from if it's a drought? Fair question. It tells us that it was a drought. It doesn't tell us there was absolutely no water in Israel. There could have still been streams. I mean, Ahab was looking for some green grass. There could have been some sources of water still running at that point. But the other piece we should remember is the location of Mount Carmel, which is right beside the ocean, the Mediterranean Sea. Might be a little bit of water in there. So they probably had enough to soak the offering a few times. Either way, they soaked the offering. Now, interestingly, when I was doing some digging into this over the last couple weeks, I actually came across an interesting research paper. We're not going to get into the specifics of it. But what it was called was the engineering analysis of the fire miracle on Mount Carmel. Someone actually took the time to analyze how much energy would be required to burn up the bull, the wood, the stones, the sand, everything in the trench, like the whole thing, and consume it. Let's just say this. He actually went to the extent of saying, could this have been a liquid form of something poured down from heaven that God lit on fire to make it go? Would it have been a gaseous state thing? Could it have been done by lightning? Like, what would have actually done this? Bottom line, there's no other way to explain this than God had to do this supernaturally. This was a miracle for God to be able to send fire to consume what was there. The energy needed to do it is astronomical. So if this is going to happen, if the altar and the soaked offering and altar is going to go, it's got to be God. No doubt about it. Verse 36. Oops, I did that. There we go. At the time of the sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, Let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God and that you are turning their hearts back again. No dancing, no shouting, no cutting, just a simple prayer offered in faith. God, if you're really God, show up. Show these people who you are. Show them that I'm actually not the troubler of Israel, but I am your servant. Show these people that you love them and you're calling them back to you. And God answers. He answers with an incredible moment of a blaze of fire that consumes the altar and the offering and all of it. Verse 38. The fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and the soil, and also licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." What was Elijah's name again? The Lord is God. He is the one who is truly God. God proves that He is truly God. He proves that Elijah is His servant, not the one who has caused this trouble for Israel, and that He is calling His people back again to Himself. So, let's wrap up this story, and then we'll move to some application for us for today. So what happens after this point is that now that the prophets of Baal have been shown to be the ones causing trouble for Israel, Elijah rounds them up, takes them down to the valley below, and has them all killed. So they won't continue to be a problem, leading God's people into idolatry. Of course, they didn't get all the prophets of Asherah, and the whole thing with Jezebel not being there is going to be a thorn in Elijah's side here pretty quick. But Elijah tells Ahab to go ahead and eat the sacrificial meal that would happen after the evening sacrifice. And while Ahab's eating, Elijah decides not to eat, but he goes further up the mountain to watch for rain. Because remember, God said, Elijah, go present yourself to Ahab, and then I will send rain on the land. Well, Elijah has just gone. He's presented himself to Ahab. He has shown Ahab that God is truly God, and now he goes and waits for the promise that God had given. And God being true to who He is, and it is another demonstration of the fact that He is truly God, does send the rain. Starting with this little tiny cloud up over the sea. But when Elijah sees even that little hint of God's promise being fulfilled, he knows it's coming and he starts to head down. Stops by Ahab's tent, lets him know, hey buddy, the rain's coming. Should head back to Jezreel. So Ahab gets in his chariot to head back. Elijah heads back on foot and he outruns him on the way back. Which is kind of a nice bookend to the whole thing of Ahab's impotence versus Elijah's power. Again, you can't even win the race when you got a horse and chariot, dude, seriously. About 17-mile run back to Jezreel from where they were on Mount Carmel. Not a bad hoof in it for Elijah. That's pretty cool. So what do we take from this story today? How do we understand what this says for us today? What the Lord is trying to actually say to us through this story? I want to share 3 ideas, I think, with you this morning that kind of are observations from the story that also lead to an application for us as we think about what God would want to say to us. And the first is that God cares about His name and about His people so much that He is not afraid to pick a fight. He's not afraid to pick a fight to demonstrate who He is, or to show us how much He loves us and to call us back to Himself from ways that we have wandered into all kinds of other places. I know there's some parents in praying for their kids who have prayed whatever it takes, which is a scary prayer. But our God is not afraid to pick a fight to show how much He loves His kids. To show up and call them back out of darkness and out of the evil we get tangled up in the world and come back to Him. To show what is truly causing trouble for His people. Which means that if we come across a crisis, if we come across a problem, we should not immediately assume we're under attack of the enemy. I think it's one of our, well, I won't say our, my. One of the ways I have interpreted trouble has been to assume the enemy's coming after me. But could it be that God brings about circumstances because he wants to show me something true about himself or about me? Could he be the one causing the crisis or the trouble in order to pull me back to him? Because honestly, he's more interested in me walking faithfully with him than he is with preventing me from having a little momentary pain. So that's the first thing. God cares enough about his name and about us that he's willing to pick a fight to show us who he is. Second thing, God wants his people to know and serve him, not follow idols. Sometimes I think, though, we're not really aware that we are following an idol or worshiping an idol. In Elijah's day, in some ways this was a little more obvious, maybe, or obvious to us with our Western modern eyes looking back. You know, Elijah lived in an agrarian society. And so people really did long for the gods of rain and weather to help make sure they were going to be okay and would have enough to eat and be safe. I think the idols of our age might look a little different. Maybe there's still some of the same ones kicking around. And honestly, you know, there's nothing new under the sun. I was reading Ecclesiastes this week. Wow. Like everything that is has been done before. Like there's nothing new. So maybe we're just going to recycle, reduce, reuse, and recycle. And we're going to go back to the same idols. But anyways, what are the idols of our age? I was kicking this around a little bit in the office this week, and Ian made a comment to me that one of the things the enemy loves to do is he loves to exploit what's valuable to a culture. He loves to exploit the things that we think are important and turn them from being something good and given by God into an idol that we worship and serve. As I was reflecting on that a little bit, I was thinking about what really matters to us in the West. Well, there were a couple things that came to mind. I'm sure there's others. But the two that came to mind were our money and our freedom to be an individual. Now, those things are not bad in and of themselves. When you think about our money can be used for all kinds of good purposes to enrich our lives and the lives of others. Money can be an incredible gift, and it can be used well. However, money and wealth and the pursuit of it can also become something that we replace our trust in God with. If only I have a little more security, if only I have a bigger pension, if only I have more investments, and I'm going to withhold from other people who could need this because I need more. Or I need more stuff that money buys, so I'll feel better about myself. It's so easy for this to shift from being a gift from God into an idol that we serve. The same thing I think is true with our freedom to be an individual. And honestly, I think we see this expressed in lots of different ways. I think we see this through the expressive individualism that kind of overwrites anything that could be good for anybody else because myself has to be primary. Whether it's in my expression of myself or whether it's in my rights as an individual, that means that you don't have any. But that, again, our individualism is good and it's beautiful because it means that there's difference between all of us. And being able to bring that expression of our individualism can be so rich when we actually come together in interdependence the way God's called us to. But it can also become an idol that we hold up and trample on others with. I wonder sometimes, what are the idols that I serve? What are the things that I've put into my life that I've made more important than God for my security, my hope, and my goodness? Could it be that some of the polarization and unrest that we feel in our world is not something that the enemy is stirring up, but is actually something that God is putting into place so we will start to examine where the idols in our lives lie? Could it be that God actually wants us to hold up a mirror to see where we're actually straying from him, so we'll come back to him because he loves us. Instead of chasing after idols, we're called to live different by pursuing holiness, pursuing life in God, pursuing him and the transforming power that comes by his Spirit through the work of Jesus on our behalf. We're called to be set apart for the purposes of God, not for idols. That's the second thing. Third piece. Observation that a power encounter doesn't fix everything. I mean, who wouldn't like to see God show up and devour an offering with fire on the top of a mountain? That sounds pretty sweet, right? Like, let's head down up to University Hill or Connaught Hill or whatever, and let's see this happen, right? This would be amazing. But the epilogue to this story, if you read on, you see that this wasn't actually enough to wipe out Baal worship in Israel. It kept going. Elijah doesn't actually even get to see the end of it. But what God does is, through Elijah, anoints Hazael to be king of Aram, Jehu to be king of Israel, and Elisha to be prophet after Elijah, so that they will continue the work that Elijah started on the mountain with this encounter of power. The big moment with God is not actually enough. We need to choose to live into the obedience that's called for by the big moment. The big moment might be the moment to point us back to God and go, oh wow, you are actually truly God. But if we don't choose to change anything in our life, but just keep walking the way we are, what difference is it going to make? We're called to actually follow Jesus. And honestly, even for him, the big moments didn't convince everybody. He fed 5,000 men in addition to women and children on the side of a mountain, and he had a church of 120 when he went to the cross. Where'd the rest of them go who saw the multiplication of bread and fish? How is it that the miracle of the resurrection wasn't enough to convince all of the people in Jerusalem? The big moment, even something as big as God raising up someone from the dead, is not enough to convince. So, instead of just hoping for something big from God, we should lean into pursuing holiness, seeking after God, asking him to shape us by his Holy Spirit. And when he does show up in the big way, praise him for that. Honor him for that. But don't expect that to be the thing that ultimately is what's going to change your life. If we're not willing to be in the quiet places with Jesus in humility and seeking after him, the big moment's not going to make a difference. All right. How are we doing, church? This is a fun story. And isn't it like a little horrifying to see the mirror that God's holding up in front of your face right now? I don't know. It's horrifying for me. So with that in mind, we're going to move to our time of response. Because as much as it's great to dig into a story like this and dig into the Word of God, we also have a place to align our hearts with the heart of God and take some time to respond to him about what he's been saying today. And so I want to invite the team to come up here. Our communion servers, if you would come at this time, prepare to serve. Our prayer team, Clint and Glenda, are going to be in the prayer room. So let me just kind of unpack what we're going to be doing here for the next several minutes for this time of response. First of all, the table of the Lord is set for us each and every week here at Lakewood. This is the Lord's table, also known as communion. And this is a space where we remember and honor and declare the sacrifice that Jesus made on our behalf, taking our sin upon himself and being nailed to a cross in Roman execution in order to carry the debt of our sin so we could be forgiven and be restored to right relationship with God through faith in Jesus. And so as we come to this table and we eat the bread, we remember and declare that his body given for us is enough to pay the debt of my sin and your sin. And we accept that Jesus did that on our behalf. And when we drink the juice, we remember and proclaim That Jesus made a new way for us to be in right relationship with God, not by perfect obedience to a law code that was given thousands of years ago, but being restored to relationship by God through his sacrificial death on the cross. So we come to this table to eat and to drink, to declare our faith that Jesus has done this for me and made me whole, and to celebrate what he's done for us. So in this first opening of our worship time, you're invited to come and receive at the table to declare that today. But we also have the prayer room open for you today. Like I said, Clint and Glenda are in there to pray with you. Maybe that's a space for you today just to bring a need that's on your heart. Or maybe it's a space to confess where you've been walking in idolatry. Following after something, putting your hope in something other than Jesus to bring fulfillment and wholeness in your life. And you just need to lay that idol down and ask God to forgive you and fill up that space with himself. But the prayer room is open for you. Please feel free to go in there at any time. By the way, the door is closed for sound. So don't think you have to wait outside the door. Just go in as you're there, close the door behind you, and as soon as the prayer team can get to you, they will. A little later on, we'll have an opportunity to give back to the Lord a portion of what he's given to us. You know, we do this exercise of giving in part to make sure money keeps its proper place in our lives, to offer some back to the Lord, almost as a first fruits of what he's given to us, so that it doesn't take over and have preeminence in our life. We sacrifice some of it to not let it consume us. And so our ushers will come a little later on to receive our offering, and we just have an opportunity to surrender it to him. And finally, we have an opportunity to worship with the worship team, singing some incredible songs to bring our hearts and our words in worship to our true King. So church, why don't you stand and let's take this time of response with our God today.